When Hannah parked her old sedan outside Uncle James' house, an odd feeling swept over her. The house, located on the outskirts of Riverstone, looked both cozy and eerie. Painted in a faded white, it stood amidst the trees, their bare branches casting long shadows over its facade. Her ginger cat, Mabel, let out a soft meow from her carrier, as if sharing her unease. James stepped onto the porch, holding a mug of coffee. His weathered face, marked by years of work and a life far from the city, still carried warmth. Yet his eyes betrayed a weariness, as though he bore an invisible burden. "Hannah," he said with a smile that felt more like an effort than genuine happiness. "Glad you're here. Was the move difficult?" "A bit, but we managed," she replied, letting Mabel out. The cat immediately began exploring her new surroundings. Inside, the house felt as old as it looked. The creaky floors, massive wooden beams, and neatly arranged books and paintings gave it a timeless charm. Hannah hadn't been here since her teenage years, but everything felt both familiar and alien. "The kitchen's all yours," James said, gesturing to a cozy yet slightly cluttered room. "Your room's upstairs. And please, don't touch the study. There are personal things in there, you know." Hannah nodded, but her gaze was already drawn to a door at the end of the hallway. An old, crooked lock hung from it, almost begging her to discover what lay behind. Later that evening, while unpacking her belongings, she heard the floorboards creak in the hallway. Looking up, she saw Mabel staring intently at that same locked door. The cat sat down and let out a loud meow, clearly demanding something. "What is it you want?" Hannah muttered, walking closer. Her hand instinctively reached for the lock but quickly pulled back. Not now, she thought. The next day, after unpacking and taking a walk around the area, Hannah decided to spend her evening in the armchair by the window. She held Mabel, who kept glancing at the study door as if sensing something. Her tea had gone cold when her eyes landed on a box under the stairs that hadn't been there before. Inside, she found old letters and photographs. One photo showed her father, James, and another man she didn't recognize. The stranger wore a theatrical mask with hollow eyes. The picture stirred vague childhood memories, a dark figure in her bedroom doorway, whispers, and the crackle of an old radio. When James entered and found Hannah holding the photo, his expression darkened. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said sharply. "Why? Who is this?" she asked, but he simply shook his head. "Hannah, some things are better left in the past." But from the look on his face, Hannah knew the past wasn't willing to let her go. The following morning, a heavy silence hung over the house. James had left early, leaving Hannah alone. The soft light filtering through the curtains painted patterns on the wooden floor. Mabel sat on the windowsill, her tail twitching nervously as if sensing the day wouldn't bring good news. Hannah couldn't shake the image of the man in the mask. Who was he? Why had James reacted so strongly? Driven by unease, she decided to dig deeper into the contents of the box under the stairs. She pulled out the photographs again. In some, her father and James looked happy. Fishing, picnics, family celebrations. But in the background of nearly every other photo, that mysterious man lingered. He always stood slightly apart, like an observer. As she sifted through the letters, she came across one written in a shaky hand. It was addressed to her mother. Asterisk, "Dear Ellen, you must stay away from Raymond. He is not who he claims to be. This also concerns the children. Protect them. Asterisk. Raymond." The name echoed faintly in her memory. But from where? Trying to piece together the puzzle, she remembered. Raymond was a name she'd heard in her childhood nightmares. That evening, unable to hold back her questions, Hannah waited for James to return. The moment he walked in, she confronted him with the letter and photo. "Who is Raymond?" she demanded, her voice firm. James froze. He didn't answer right away, instead sinking slowly into a chair and rubbing his face with his hands. "Raymond," he finally began. "He was your father's friend. At first. But then something changed. He started coming around too often, asking strange questions. One day, I caught him in your room when you were very young. I told your parents they had to do something. And they kicked him out?" Hannah asked, her anxiety growing. "They tried," James muttered. "But he always came back. Like a shadow. And then..." He trailed off, his words heavy with unspoken pain. "And then my parents died," Hannah finished for him. James looked at her with a deep sorrow in his eyes but didn't deny it. That night, trying to process the flood of emotions, Hannah stepped onto the porch. The cold night air carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the rustle of the trees. Suddenly, Mabel darted beyond the porch light's reach, her tail disappearing into the darkness. Grabbing a flashlight, Hannah followed her. She found Mabel on an old path leading into the woods. The cat sat by a tree root, intently focused on something. Hannah approached and saw a medallion lying on the ground. Silver, with a pattern that seemed familiar. She picked it up, feeling a strange sense of recognition. Out of nowhere, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Hannah turned to see James standing nearby. His face was clouded with worry. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "I want the truth, James." "You owe me that," she replied, clutching the medallion tightly. James stepped closer. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the tension in the air shifted to something almost tender. Hesitating, he touched her hand, his gaze falling on the medallion. "This is all that's left of those times," he whispered. "And you're getting too close to the things I've tried to protect you from." Hannah could hear the change in his voice, a mix of fear and resignation. Taking a step closer, she felt the weight of the unsaid between them. The past wasn't done with either of them, and it was about to reveal its final, chilling secret. The sky over Riverstone was overcast, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Hannah sat in the kitchen, turning the medallion she'd found the previous night in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, and the cold metal seemed to seep into her skin. The initials RD were engraved on its surface, and each touch brought her thoughts back to the name Raymond. Mabel leapt onto the table and sat directly in front of her, staring at the medallion with unblinking eyes. Her gaze felt almost like a warning. Hannah sighed, stroking the cat. "What am I supposed to do, Mabel?" she whispered, not expecting an answer. At that moment, the door slammed, and James walked in. His boots were muddy, and his face showed signs of exhaustion. "You need to stop digging into this, Hannah," he said sharply, removing his coat. "The more you search, the closer you get to danger." "Danger?" Hannah raised an eyebrow. "I'm already neck-deep in it. You might as well tell me what's threatening me." James bit his lip, torn between protecting her and his fear of revealing the truth. "Fine," he said at last. "But we'll talk in the woods. It's easier to explain there." The forest was shrouded in a dense mist. The tree branches looked like skeletal arms reaching toward the sky. Hannah followed James, clutching a flashlight tightly. Mabel trailed behind them, moving smoothly, like a shadow. "This place is tied to Raymond," James began, stopping by an old tree marked with strange carvings on its bark. "He wasn't just a friend of your parents. He was part of something bigger." Hannah frowned. "Something bigger?" James turned to her, his face grim. "We called it the Circle. It was like a club of sorts. But Raymond, he always wanted more. He liked to keep people afraid. I warned your father not to trust him. But no one listened." A chill ran down Hannah's spine. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James shook his head. "One day, he went too far. He became obsessed with you, Hannah. You were just a child, but he saw something special in you. Your father tried to keep him away, but a month later, your parents died in the fire." Hannah froze, her thoughts racing. Her childhood suddenly took on a darker, more sinister tone. The silence of the forest felt deafening. When they reached an old cabin deep in the woods, Hannah stopped in her tracks. The cabin was covered in moss, its windows shattered. Mabel climbed onto her shoulder, holding her breath as if sensing the weight of the moment. "Raymond lived here after he disappeared," James explained. "But one day, he just vanished. I thought that was the end of it." Inside, the cabin was empty, except for a map pinned to the wall with a red X marking a spot. Hannah reached for it, but James grabbed her hand. "Don't touch it," he shouted, his voice filled with fear. Their eyes met. In his gaze, Hannah saw not only concern but something else she couldn't define. For a brief moment, the forest, the cabin, and the medallion seemed to fade away, leaving only the silence between them. She couldn't stop herself. A surge of emotion overtook her, and before she knew what she was doing, she raised her face to James. Their lips met in a brief but tender kiss. But just as quickly he pulled away, his face tightening with conflict. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have," he said, turning and stepping out of the cabin, leaving Hannah with the feeling that she had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The rain began suddenly, as if the sky decided to wash away the dust of the secrets that hung over Riverstone. The sound of raindrops echoed on the roof as Hannah returned from the forest, clutching the map she had taken from the cabin despite James' protests. Mabel jumped onto her lap, sensing Hannah's need for comfort. The ginger cat had always been her quiet guardian, especially when reality felt too overwhelming. Hannah spread the map on the kitchen table. The red X marked a location at the edge of the woods, near the river, a place she had heard about in old rumors but never visited. She glanced at the window, where rain continued to fall. Her curiosity outweighed her fear. She picked up her phone to call James but hesitated. Their conversations had grown more strained, especially after the tension between them in the cabin. Something told her that if she wanted to end this, she would have to go alone. The trail to the river was muddy from the rain. Mabel followed Hannah relentlessly, despite her attempts to send the cat home. Mabel moved with purpose, as if she knew the way, and Hannah trusted her instincts. When they arrived at the marked spot, Hannah stopped. Before her lay an overgrown patch of land, the faint outlines of a foundation barely visible. This had once been a house, now reduced to rubble. In the center of the clearing, the ground looked freshly disturbed, as if someone had been digging there recently. "What is this?" Hannah muttered, but her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a snapping twig. She turned to see James standing nearby, his face wet from the rain and filled with worry. "You shouldn't have come here alone," he said sharply. "This place. It was never meant to be disturbed." "Why?" Hannah stepped closer. "Is something buried here? What don't you want me to find?" His silence spoke volumes. Hannah grabbed a stick and began digging, ignoring his protests. After a few minutes, her hands hit something hard. She pulled out an old metal box. "Open it, and you'll understand everything," James said quietly at last. Inside the box were documents, letters, and photographs. Every photo showed Raymond, but now he looked different. Tense, weary, surrounded by people who seemed to follow him. These were the members of the circle James had mentioned. Among the documents was a journal detailing Raymond's plans. Raymond believed Hannah had a rare gift he wanted to exploit. He saw her as the key to his dark ambitions. Her parents had tried to protect her, but their defiance of Raymond had ended in tragedy. "We destroyed him," James said. "But I was never sure he was truly gone. His ideas, his influence. They lived on in others." Hannah realized her fears weren't just shadows of her past. They were still a threat. But now, knowing the truth, she felt stronger. She looked at James. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said firmly. "This ends here." The next day, Hannah and James burned the box. They stood side by side, watching as the flames consumed the remnants of the past. Mabel sat nearby, her tail swishing rhythmically as if she understood the significance of the moment. "Are you sure about this?" James asked. Hannah nodded. "All he ever wanted was to keep us afraid. But now I'm free." She turned her gaze to the forest where it had all begun. The rain had stopped, and sunlight filtered through the trees. For the first time in a long while, she felt the darkness that had loomed over her life begin to lift.